Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel and stay updated on more historical stories. The persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe, ghettos, mass shootings, and the destruction of communities. The persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe during the Second World War represents one of the most devastating episodes in modern history. It was a process that unfolded gradually yet relentlessly, combining ideological hatred, administrative planning, and extreme violence. Unlike the later phase of extermination carried out in industrial killing centers, the destruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe occurred largely in towns, villages, forests, ravines, and urban neighborhoods that had been home to Jewish communities for centuries. The genocide was not hidden behind distant walls, but unfolded in full view of local populations, leaving deep scars on the landscape and collective memory. Before the war, Eastern Europe was the heartland of Jewish civilization. Millions of Jews lived in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and neighboring regions. These communities were diverse, ranging from large urban populations to small rural shtetls. Jewish life was deeply interwoven with local economies, crafts, trade, education, and culture. Synagogues, schools, charitable organizations, and political movements flourished. Despite persistent anti-Semitism, legal discrimination, and periodic violence, Jewish society in Eastern Europe remained resilient and vibrant. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 shattered this world. With the German invasion of Poland, Jews immediately became targets of systematic repression. Anti-Jewish measures were introduced with speed and precision. Jews were forced to wear identifying symbols, excluded from professions, subjected to arbitrary arrests, and stripped of property. These policies were not merely punitive. They were designed to isolate Jews socially and psychologically, transforming neighbors into outsiders and enemies in the eyes of the state. As German power expanded eastward, persecution intensified. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a decisive turning point. Vast territories with large Jewish populations fell under German control, and the ideological war against racial enemies became a central component of military strategy. Jews were portrayed as political threats, biological dangers, and enemies of civilization. This rhetoric provided justification for unprecedented levels of violence against civilian populations. One of the earliest and most visible mechanisms of persecution was the establishment of ghettos. Ghettos were enclosed urban districts where Jews were forcibly relocated and confined. They were not intended to provide protection or stability, but to concentrate Jewish populations under conditions that ensured suffering and high mortality. Overcrowding was extreme. Entire families were often forced to share single rooms, while basic sanitation collapsed under the pressure of population density. Food shortages defined daily life in the ghettos. Official rations were set deliberately below survival levels, forcing inhabitants to rely on smuggling or black market trade. Hunger weakened bodies and spirits alike, making resistance increasingly difficult. Diseases such as typhus spread rapidly, exacerbated by malnutrition and lack of medical supplies. Death became a constant presence, not only from violence but from the slow erosion of life itself. Ghettos also functioned as instruments of control and exploitation. Jewish labor was used extensively for construction, manufacturing, and military supply. Forced labor units operated under brutal conditions, with workers beaten, underfed, and executed for minor infractions. The economic exploitation of Jewish labor occurred alongside systematic robbery, as homes, businesses, and personal belongings were confiscated by occupying authorities. Administration within the ghettos was imposed through Jewish councils, known as Judenräte. These councils were placed in impossible positions, ordered to carry out directives under threat of death. They were responsible for distributing food, organizing labor, maintaining order, and eventually compiling lists for deportations. Their actions have been debated extensively, but it is essential to understand the extreme coercion under which they operated. No decision offered safety or moral clarity. While ghettos represented a form of slow destruction, mass shootings brought sudden and irreversible annihilation. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen began systematic executions of Jews across Eastern Europe. These units operated behind the front lines, supported by military authorities, local police, and collaborators. Their mission was clear: eliminate Jewish populations entirely. Mass shootings followed a grimly consistent pattern. Jewish residents were rounded up under false pretenses, often told they were being resettled or registered for labor. They were marched to nearby execution sites, typically forests, ravines, or abandoned quarries. There, victims were forced to undress, surrender valuables, and line up at the edge of pits. Executions were carried out at close range, with bodies falling into mass graves. One of the most notorious sites of mass murder was Babin Yar, where tens of thousands of Jews were killed in a matter of days in September 1941. Yet Babin Yar was not unique. Across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and eastern Poland, thousands of similar sites existed. Many remain unmarked to this day, their victims unnamed, and their stories forgotten for decades. The psychological impact of these killings was profound. Victims were forced to witness the deaths of family members before being killed themselves. Entire communities were erased in a single day. Survivors who escaped execution carried lifelong trauma, haunted by memories of violence and loss. The killers, too, were affected, with reports indicating emotional strain and alcoholism among executioners, leading authorities to seek alternative methods of mass murder. Local populations played complex and varied roles. In some areas, collaboration was widespread, driven by anti-Semitism, fear, opportunism, or coercion. Neighbors denounced Jews, assisted in roundups, or participated directly in violence. In other cases, individuals and families risked their lives to hide Jews, provide food, or help them escape. Such acts of rescue were rare and extremely dangerous, often punished by death. As the war progressed, ghettos were systematically liquidated. Liquidation actions were characterized by extreme brutality. Streets were sealed, houses searched, and residents dragged from hiding places. Those deemed unfit for labor, including children and the elderly, were shot on the spot. Others were deported to extermination camps or executed nearby. Ghettos that had existed for years disappeared in a matter of days. Despite overwhelming odds, resistance emerged. Armed uprisings in ghettos represented acts of defiance against inevitable destruction. Jewish partisans also formed in forests, engaging in sabotage and guerrilla warfare. These efforts rarely altered military outcomes, but carried immense moral and symbolic weight. They demonstrated that Jews were not passive victims, but individuals capable of resistance under the most extreme conditions. The liberation of Eastern Europe did not end Jewish suffering. Survivors returned to destroyed communities, often facing hostility, indifference, or renewed violence. Property was rarely returned, and anti-Semitism persisted in many regions. Some survivors chose to emigrate, recognizing that their pre-war world could never be restored. Others remained, bearing witness in societies that were often unwilling to listen. For decades, the history of mass shootings in Eastern Europe remained underrepresented in public memory. Political factors, especially during the Cold War, suppressed discussion of local collaboration and Jewish victimhood. Many execution sites were left unmarked, their stories preserved only in survivor testimonies and scattered documents. Only in recent years have efforts been made to document these crimes systematically. Understanding the persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Genocide was not carried out solely by distant authorities, but involved countless individuals operating within familiar environments. Ordinary streets, schools, and forests became sites of extraordinary crimes. The mechanisms of exclusion, dehumanization, and violence unfolded step by step, often with little resistance from surrounding societies. This history carries enduring lessons. It reveals how quickly social norms can collapse under ideological pressure and how dangerous it is to define groups of people as enemies or subhuman. The destruction of Jewish life in Eastern Europe was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by governments, institutions, and individuals. Today, the memory of destroyed communities survives through research, memorials, and education. Restoring names, stories, and histories to the victims is an essential act of justice. Remembering ghettos and mass shootings is not only about the past, it is a warning for the future. It reminds humanity of the consequences of hatred, indifference, and unchecked power. The persecution of Jews in Eastern Europe stands as a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. Amid unimaginable suffering, acts of courage, solidarity, and resistance endured. Preserving this history is a moral obligation, ensuring that the voices silenced by violence continue to speak across generations.